Morning, everyone, and welcome. Can you hear me at the back? You can hear me? Okay, my name is Nick Mansfield. I'm the Dean of Higher Degree Research. A bit later on, I will give an explanation about exactly what my role is and how it fits into the Macquarie system. But first, I want to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, who are the Wadawurrung clan of the Darug Nation, and pay respects to their elders past, present, and any other Indigenous people who might be with us today. It's important to acknowledge the long history of education and wisdom that's taken place on this land for perhaps 60,000 years, and to connect with that as well as we introduce ourselves in the context of higher education. Okay, so I'm standing in at this initial welcome for Professor Saki Pretorius, who's the Deputy Vice-Chancellor of Research at Macquarie University. Saki's a very distinguished microbiologist, expert in wine. If you want to talk, I think he's probably Australia's greatest expert on wine, from the genes right up to the table. And it's a daunting experience sharing a bottle of wine with Saki, I have to say. So he's a distinguished microbiologist with a worldwide reputation, and he delegates responsibility for higher degree research to a couple of offices, my office and the Higher Degree Research Office. And I'll explain in a minute a little bit about exactly what those offices do. But I'll welcome you on Saki's behalf to Macquarie University. And I know what he would say is what distinguishes a university is its research. And the backbone of research in universities is the work of higher degree research candidates. So we don't consider you as just students that we're educating or training. We consider you as participants and partners in the ongoing research mission of the university, which is by far the most important thing in distinguishing what a university is. That's what places universities at the forefront of educational institutions. They link teaching and research. They believe that the discovery and advancement of knowledge and the dissemination of knowledge, research on the one hand, teaching on the other, are inextricably linked to one another, and that higher degree research students occupy one of the most important functions in the advancement of research. In Australia, so different to some other countries, 70% of research is undertaken in universities. In other countries, United States, for example, a lot of research is undertaken in industry. That's less prominent a factor in Australia. Universities are by far the greatest driver of innovative thinking and research in the country, and over half of that research is undertaken by higher degree research students. So it's absolutely crucial to the university, to its identity, and to its mission, and also to the wider society and beyond the wider society of Australia, to humanity in general. So it's a hugely important thing to the university. You're hugely important people to the university, and beyond the university to the society to which your research is going to contribute. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what higher degree research actually is, and you'll see that abbreviation everywhere you go. Across Australia, research training is broadly summarised under that heading, HDR. It's a more Australian term than it is anywhere else. Higher degree research, higher degrees by research are the various ways in which it's glossed. Okay, in Australia, the predominant degree undertaken by research trainees is the PhD, the doctorate. That's not true in every country, but in Australia, somewhere between 90 and 95% of people enrolled in higher degrees by research are enrolled in doctorates, in the PhD in particular. There are two classes of doctorates at the research level. The research level is the highest level in the Australian Qualifications Framework, level 10. It's the highest degree awarded in Australia and equal to the highest degrees, academic qualifications, awarded globally. The two types of doctorate are the research doctorate and the professional doctorate. The research doctorate, on the whole, is the predominant one at Macquarie University. We do also teach, there are other doctorates, the Doctor of Jurisprudence, doctors in other health areas, the MD has just been introduced at Macquarie. They don't have the equal status to the PhD, to the research degree. So it's the overwhelming top level of academic qualification across the country. What also distinguishes it is that it requires a performance at the highest academic standard. So when your PhD is submitted, we'll look at this later today, when your PhD is submitted, the first question that the examiner is asked is this an original contribution to knowledge? At the end of today, we're going to look at the exact template that examiners are required to fill in. Is this an original contribution to knowledge? What it means by that is, are you going out beyond what knowledge is already achieved, where the domain of knowledge is already defined? Are you going out into new territory? So you're being judged at the standard of innovation, at the very forefront, the avant-garde, if you like, of your academic field. So that's putting you at a much higher standard with a much higher requirement than you're normally expected as coursework students. So a lot of you would have been coming to this degree having completed coursework programs, having done small research programs. Now you're being required to perform at the same academic standard as all academic researchers around the world. In coursework programs, you tend to be enclosed within the standards defined by the institution. Your aim is to please your teachers. When you reach the level of the research degree, you're moving beyond the university and being judged at that foreground level of research. Okay. So let's have a look at what the definition of a doctorate actually is, what the standard of a doctorate actually is, and where better to go than the Australian government, that source of all wisdom. And as I mentioned earlier, all higher education qualifications in Australia are defined in a national document called the Australian Qualifications Framework. Almost every country has a qualifications framework like this. The PhD sits at the top. And it's actually be quite interesting for you to have a look at the AQF. It's quite a dry document. It's easily available on the web. But it does have a lot of information about what standards are expected at each academic level. And every Australian university has to conform to these standards. So what's the doctorate according to the Australian Qualifications Framework? Graduates at this level will have systematic and critical understanding of a complex field of learning and specialized research skills for the advancement of learning and or for professional practice. So, okay, two types of knowledge, as I said earlier. The advancement of learning, on one hand, research for itself, for its own sake, and or professional practice. So the overwhelming majority of you will be engaged in the advancement of learning. So what are you required to exhibit when you reach the end of your degree? Systematic and critical understanding of a complex field of learning in the first place. Okay, so the first thing you need to do is have a good knowledge of your own research field. Okay, so you have to know what work is being undertaken in your field. You have to know the methodologies that are available. You have to know the broad scope of the research in your area. And then what do you need to do? You need to exhibit specialized research skills for the advancement of learning. Okay, so you have to know your field and you have to go beyond its present state and take it into the future. That's the double edge of the doctorate. Some of you will be undertaking, a small number, will be undertaking research master's degrees, slightly lower qualification on the Australian Qualifications Framework, smaller thesis, shorter period of enrolment, and a slightly lower standard in terms of, or a slightly different standard, let me put it that way, slightly different standard in the expectation. Graduates at this level will have specialized knowledge and skills for research and or professional practice and or further learning. Less emphasis on novelty and innovation, okay, at the master's level. So the master's is more a transitional degree leading you on into the higher. It's where you really need to be able to exhibit a good, solid understanding of a research field and to participate in that research field. But it doesn't have that same expectation that you get at level 10, which is to move beyond the advancement of knowledge into a new area. Okay, so let me talk quickly through the way the university is structured around research, just to give you an idea. You'll hear the names of lots of office holders, lots of committees. I'll give you a quick rundown on what some of those office holders are and what the committees actually do. As I mentioned, overall responsibility for research training, which is what the heading that HDR comes under in the Australian government parlance. Research training is funded on the Research Training Program, the RTP. That's the second phrase that you'll commonly hear attributed to describe research, what you're doing. Is Professor Saki Pretorius. I've said a little bit about Saki already. He's very busy. He's responsible for all the research that's undertaken at the university, all research funding, all research publications and outputs, attracting, cultivating research, building laboratories, teams, and so on, as well as for research training. So he delegates responsibility for research training to 2 offices. So there's my office, the Office of the Dean, and I'll say again a little bit later what we fundamentally do, and I'll go into this in detail, and you'll meet some of the people who work with me a bit later. What we fundamentally do is we guarantee the quality both of the academic output of your work in terms of monitoring the examination process to guarantee that you meet the standards that are required. We also work on applications and scholarships, ranking scholarship applicants in order to determine who are the best candidates to be offered scholarships. We also work on the quality of supervision and providing support for you in a number of areas. And you'll meet the people from each of those areas as we go through the day. The administrative side of higher degree research is the responsibility of the Higher Degree Research Office, with whom you would have had heaps of correspondence. Its executive director is Dr. Ren Yi. Ren's actually in Canberra meeting with the government this morning, but his deputy director, Dr. Louise Wedlock, is here, and Louise will be presenting after me. So you would have received lots of correspondence from the HDRO, and they're the key linchpin of all administrative matters in the university. Okay, so administrative and academic is probably the broad way to distinguish those 2 offices. The offices are separate. We both report directly to Saki, but Ren and I are good friends. We get on well, and we collaborate on all issues to do with making your experience as positive as possible. Now, most of you, the predominant relationship that you will have is going to be inside the faculty with your supervisor. And so faculties have a lot of initiative and autonomy and prerogative when it comes to administering HDR. And each of the faculties, the person in charge of the HDR process for the faculty is the Associate Dean. The Associate Dean, Higher Degree Research. Now, they will be joining us later today, just before lunch. They'll be here to be introduced. But probably, if any issues arise for you in your candidature, you need to try and sort them out at the local level as much as possible. That would mean engaging with HDR administration and the leadership within your department. Firstly, of course, your supervisor is probably the person that you need to talk to most. But failing that, the Associate Dean is outside of your department, is the one who is going to be most helpful in trying to deal with any issues or questions that you might have. They're all lovely, experienced, well-informed people, very approachable about any issue to do with HDR. Okay, now to get really boring, we'll talk about the academic committees of the university. I always take people through this, and I know this is really dry, and these committees will seem really remote, but they are actually the ones that determine what your experience is going to be like. So it is kind of important when you hear these names bandied about that you have some idea who and what they are and what they do. So overall responsibility for academic matters at the university falls to the Academic Senate. The Academic Senate has all of the university executive and representatives from every faculty and student representatives on it at each level. So there's an HDR representative on Academic Senate. Academic Senate is a large committee of about 40 or 50 people and has very intense meetings about academic policy matters, and they make the final decisions and recommendations to the council about academic matters. So basically, nothing has happened academically in the university till it's at least been reported to the Academic Senate. The Academic Senate agenda is vast. Each meeting, it's like 400 or 500 pages long. So they have to delegate their responsibility for research training to what's called the Research and Research Training Committee. The Research and Research Training Committee reports to the Academic Senate. Saki chairs it. And that's actually the one that signs off on anything that happens to you. So if there is your academic results, for example, once they've been approved by the Research and Research Training Committee, then your degree will be formally awarded. It then reports that to Academic Senate, but it's the decision maker when it comes to academic matters to do with higher degree research and all research matters. Okay, again, it delegates its responsibility for examination processes, which is the real crunch time decision, to the Thesis Examination Subcommittee, which is a committee that I chair, and it receives all examiners' reports, reads them all, and judges whether you're going to be awarded your degree or not. It's a committee of the Associate Deans, High Degree Research, and myself, and other faculty representatives. And it's a committee that takes very seriously its responsibility ensuring academic quality of examination outcomes at the university. So you'll hear about that committee when you're getting towards the end of your candidature. Administrative matters, now those committees are in a kind of hierarchy. TESC reports to RRTC and RRTC reports to Senate. Senate reports to the University Council. So that's the real chain of command at the university. The High Degree Management Committee is a practical committee that's focused on management issues and sits outside of that chain of command. It's where people can get together from across the university and work out how to deal with administrative matters in particular for high degree research candidates. Okay, so I say all that. I know it's not especially invigorating and inspiring as information, but it is kind of important for you to know what these terms mean as they get thrown around. You'll be told, if there's any kind of question mark at the process of examination in your case, you'll be told it's being considered by TESC, it's before the RRTC. Or it's kind of important to know how these committees are positioned in relation to one another. Finally, there's the ethics committees, and later this afternoon we'll hear from Dr. Shannon Smith, who's the Research Integrity Officer at the university, about the ethics committees that the university runs. Australia has the strictest ethics requirements for research in the world, and I don't know why that is, but we do. And the university is required to run 3 ethics committees and all research that relates firstly to human subjects, even to the point of whether you're just going to interview somebody, if you're going to give them a questionnaire. All that needs to be approved by the Human Research Ethics Committee. If you're going to have anything to do with animals, it needs to be approved by the Animal Ethics Committee. And finally, anything that might touch on biosafety issues, there's also a biosafety committee. So again, that's not going to impact on everybody, but if your research involves animal or human subjects or potential biosafety issues, you need to have an understanding of what the processes of approval for that will require, and your supervisor will be able to help and guide you through that. Okay, so the Dean HDR role. So what do I do? Firstly, as I said, my responsibility is largely about the quality of HDR, both in terms of admissions, so we rank scholarships, outcomes, we judge examinations, and sign off on them, and also in terms of the quality of the experience that you have. So there's a team in my office whose responsibility is to work with supervisors, to upskill supervisors, and make sure they're aware of the best kind of practices in supervision that are available through the literature and research. They run workshops, training programs, and so on, in order to guarantee the quality of supervision. So I'll work down that list. We're also responsible for any issues to do with the curriculum of the Master of Research program and high degree research curriculum. So we have to make sure that the kinds of support and facilities we're offering allow our candidates to compete and to complete the requirements of the Australian Qualifications Framework. We work on admissions and scholarships with the HDRO. We work on examination, as I've said. We have the support and development team. As I said, you'll meet those again later today. It's got the supervision component. There's a learning skills component. There's a professional skills development component. And there's also a peer-to-peer support program through the HDR mentors. We also try and monitor the quality of student experience by running student feedback. Once a year, we administer the MUSEC-R survey. That'll come in October to all of you. It starts in October, runs through to the end of the year. And we do want as many students as possible, all students if possible, to provide comprehensive feedback about their experience here at the university, which is hugely important in our forward planning. And I also work in policy and development, especially, of course, in the HDR area. So last year, we completely rewrote the thesis examination policy. This year, we're currently piloting a new policy about HDR supervision through Academic Senate. That's before Academic Senate at the moment. Again, those policies, not absolutely riveting to read, but worth having a look at. They do contain all information, publicly available information about the university's policies and processes in the HDR area. There's 6 to 8 HDR policies, so it'd be worth having a look at them as well, just to familiarize yourself with them. They're all available on Policy Central on the university website. And finally, I'm a member of the Australian Council of Graduate Research. That's the peak national body of people in my position around the country. We meet twice a year, and largely in order to try and influence government in areas of how it affects research training. And as you know, as I've said earlier, since research training is such a huge component of research in Australia, more than a third of research, half research in universities, a third of the research in the country is done by PhD students. It's hugely important that we get the policy settings from the government right. The government is very interested in research training and has a huge impact on what we do. So that the primary function of that body is to share best practice, but also to negotiate with the government about future developments. Okay, so I've run through the HDR support and development team in those 4 areas. We'll be meeting those 3 of those people today. The supervision team is largely supervisor-focused and not student-focused, but we'll also be looking at meeting Dr. Juliet Lum a bit later. Sally Purcell and Kim is around as well, so you'll be hearing from all of those people through the day. Okay, just want to say a little bit about supervision. Probably the most important thing that the university is going to offer you during your candidature is supervision. And the relationship that you have with your supervisor is by far the most important relationship that the university offers. Student feedback across not only the university but across the sector, across the world, really shows that PhD candidates are happy when they're happy with their supervision. They have a good experience when they're happy with their supervision. Okay, so there's a whole set of categories of supervision. The most important supervisor and the one who has ultimate responsibility for your candidate is your principal supervisor. Principal supervisor has to be a Macquarie University staff member, and they have ultimate administrative and academic responsibility for your candidature. So it's hugely important that you work with your principal supervisor, you see them as your first port of call, source of all wisdom and advice. They won't know everything, but they should be able to point you in the right direction. Everybody also has an associate supervisor. Associate supervisor can take a variety of different forms. Associate supervisors can be more or less active. If you're working on an interdisciplinary project where your principal supervisor has specialization, specialist skills and knowledge in one particular area of your project, you might like to have an associate supervisor who has expertise in another area of your project. So they complement one another. You always have somebody to go to. It's very common, in fact, or normal really, for your knowledge and project to be a bit beyond the scope of the knowledge of your supervisor. In the olden days, everybody's supervisor knew more than they did, but in the last 50 years, there's been such an exponential growth in the amount of research undertaken worldwide and the amount of knowledge there is, and an increasing specialization of the research projects undertaken by all researchers, but especially by high-degree research candidates, that you are going to become, before you know it, the world's leading expert on your particular topic. You're going to know things about it that your supervisor doesn't know. And it's their role, fundamentally, to guide and support you as you go out in that new area of discovery, but your knowledge is going to be beyond theirs. So it is helpful if there's a limit to what they know about your project, that you seek advice and support from others who do know. Of course, out in the open, publicly, with your supervisor's cooperation. And that can be one of the functions of an associate supervisor. The associate supervisor can be less active. They can simply be your reserve supervisor, who's there in case your principal supervisor, I don't know, supervisors are like human beings. They die, they move away. And sometimes they go on leave. So your associate supervisor can often step into the breach when your principal supervisor is away. So they might be less active, but it's good to keep them up to speed with what your project is and how it's developing, in case they suddenly take on your supervision role. Okay, now there's a whole lot of other categories of supervisor as well, and some of you will have supervisors in these categories and some of you won't. And so if you don't have all these, you should have a principal supervisor and an associate supervisor, but these other categories are not kind of required for every candidate, but they do fit with certain types of projects. An adjunct supervisor is simply a supervisor who is not an employee of Macquarie University, but is performing a supervisory function. Now, if you're on a coach-you-tell degree, who's on a coach-you-tell program? Okay, so quite a number of you. You will all have supervisors at your home institutions or at the other institutions where you're enrolled. And from Macquarie's point of view, that person might be your principal supervisor over there, but they're an adjunct supervisor to Macquarie, and that's how they'll be entered onto the Macquarie system. There are other types of adjunct supervisor. Again, you might need, when you're looking for expertise that goes beyond the expertise of your local supervisors, it might be somebody at another university, it might be somebody in a research institute, might be somebody in industry, and that they might be and they would be listed on the Macquarie system as an adjunct supervisor. There's another category, industry, adjunct supervisor, industry end user. Is that the full title? Something like that. That's actually a new category that's been introduced by the government in the last few months, in a very short period of time. And that's basically for people who are undertaking projects that are embedded in industry. That category of supervisor is required to have an equal role in your supervision and a formal appointment. That's not anymore? Okay, so the government has a tendency to announce and implement things and then change them once you've set up the system within months, and that, you know, so you can completely then reconfigure everybody's identity, and then they suddenly tell you, actually, when I say the government in Australia, it's actually just two guys in an office in Canberra, isn't it? And Ren's meeting them today. One of them's called Luke. I can't remember what the other one is. Yeah, and they ring you up sometimes, and you know, well, I'm sure they're very well equipped to undertake their job. Anyway, some of these decisions are a little bit improvised, but that was a category that we were given, and now so if your project is engaged with industry and you have a formally appointed adjunct supervisor in industry, we need to report that to the government now under this heading as an industry end user supervisor. HDR cultural advisor is a new category that's in the draft policy that's just about to be approved by Academic Senate, I hope. HDR cultural advisor is for candidates who are undertaking research, who are themselves Indigenous, or undertaking research on Indigenous topics or on Indigenous land. And it's important, Indigenous knowledge, as I mentioned earlier, has this hugely long tradition and very complicated protocols and real sensitivities. So it's really important if you're undertaking that kind of research, it's very important that you understand and respect all the requirements and protocols about knowledge and about accessing Indigenous land in particular. An HDR cultural advisor will be appointed with the guidance of Wollongomarru, which is Macquarie's Indigenous Strategic Planning Office, in order to provide you with support for undertaking topics and for undertaking research either as or in relation to Indigenous matters. There's also another category of HDR advisor, and this is where you might be out undertaking field work, again, in industry, out in the national park or whatever. You know, we have people who go out counting birds in national parks. There might be a ranger in a national park who is undertaking some kind of supervisory role and needs acknowledgement of that role, and they can be given the job of HDR advisor. So those are the broad categories. As I said, the last three won't be relevant, or the last four really won't be relevant to all projects, but it does span the different roles that are available in supervision. There is the HDR supervision policy and procedure, as I mentioned. It's just about to change, so in a couple of months there will be a new policy and procedure up on Policy Central. But again, it is worth having a look at that because it does outline all the different responsibilities of the different officers around the university in relation to your candidature. Okay, now having said that about supervision, the most important thing about HDR candidature is educating you to become an autonomous researcher, a self-reliant researcher. As I mentioned, through the life of your candidature, you're going to get to know more about your topic and your research area and more about what's innovative in that area than your supervisor and potentially than anybody in the world. You're going to become the world's leading expert on your topic. People are going to come and ask you questions and seek your advice about it. If we give you a PhD at the end of 3 years, what we're saying to the world is, this is a person who can design, commence, and undertake, complete, and then report a major research project on their own within a limited time frame. So that's basically what we're saying when we give you a degree. That's what the AQF requires of us. What we're basically saying is you can leave here, go out, and undertake a major research project from conception through question, through research design, project management, field work, research, data collection, literature review, analysis, argument, writing and communication, reporting. You can do that on your own. You don't need anybody to do that for you. You don't need anybody to tell you how to do it. You know basically how to do it. So the role of your supervisor is to guide you and support you and to make you aware of possibilities, resources, possible directions in which you might go, connections and networks you might follow, pieces of equipment you're not aware of, etc. Questions, challenges. They suggest these things to you, but you are in the driving seat totally. It's about your leadership of your project and your completion of your project to this required standard. So their role is fundamentally supportive, mentoring and guiding. It's not telling you what to do. That's up to you, and that's what it's all about. So it's all about you using those people as a resource in order to become an autonomous researcher. Okay, so just to finish off, just a little bit, as I mentioned, the most important thing that the university offers you is supervision, but we also want to try and hook you into what we call the intellectual climate of the university. We want you to engage with and participate in the research culture of your department, of the HDR community, of the research community more general, your faculty and the university more broadly. And this is something that can be initiated by departments or can be initiated by candidates themselves. But it's hugely important for you to feel, as you're working on your individual project, that you're actually part of an ongoing research community that both supports and stimulates you and that you learn from and that learns from you as you go. So it's hugely important that the university tries to provide for you an intellectual culture and community in which you can belong and participate. The university also provides a huge range of support services, and we're going to hear from a number of them today, and they can be in the HDR area, but they're in the university space more broadly. So you'll hear today from Campus Wellbeing about all the different resources that are available, largely in kind of personal support areas, so for general health, mental health, counseling, advocacy, all kinds of range of different areas, resources that the university wants you to take advantage of, puts in place in order to benefit you as you go through Canada, as you meet various challenges. There are personal challenges and academic challenges in undertaking a PhD, and the academic challenges are ones that you work through in collaboration with your research supervision team and within the faculty, but the other challenges, we provide a huge range of resources and officers in order to support you through those, and we want you to take advantage of those support services as and when you need them. That's what they're there for. They're totally confidential. Something you tell to Campus Wellbeing, to a counsellor or whatever, won't be told to your supervisor or anybody else unless you want that to happen. Okay? So, and we're bound to that not only by professional ethics, but by New South Wales government legislation that requires almost absolute privacy about confidential information. So you can trust those officers that your well-being is the most important thing to them. And finally, just to reiterate the point that I made earlier about the importance of what you do to the university and more broadly than that. And this is something that I say over and over again to almost every meeting of students, and some of you might have heard me say this before, but the importance of research is the most misunderstood thing globally, in my opinion. Research is actually the single most powerful activity that is undertaken in the world. Why is it powerful? It's not powerful in the traditional way in which we understand power, which is executive power. The executive power of somebody who can make a decision about something, a decision to invade a country, a decision to initiate a policy. But every idea that is generated, no matter in what field, whether it's in the field of education, from before school, things that happen in preschools, things that happen in schools, things that happen in hospitals, things that happen in the court system, things that happen in government policy, in economic policy, what doctors do to you, what teachers do to you, what psychologists, psychiatrists say, what economists do, what diplomats do, everything that happens in the world is either the result of research, most of which is undertaken at university, or is severely impacted by research. So research is the thing that actually defines how the world works and how we're going to live and kind of what we are, what our bodies are like, what our psychological well-being is defined as. All of that is impacted by research. Researchers don't make decisions about exactly what policy is going to be implemented, but the ideas for those policies all come from researchers. So when you undertake research, you're contributing to this vast global enterprise that has the hugest impact on the way human beings, and more than human beings, get to live. You might only feel that you're having an impact on, other researchers. You might be doing, I'm a theorist. I'm a theorist in the field of culture. So the impact that I have is largely on other academics and other philosophers. But when you make that kind of contribution, you're participating in this vast organic enterprise undertaken by millions of people around the world. The input that you make over here could result, after a long and complex and elaborate chain reaction, in an output over there that you have no idea about, that you're unaware of in a completely different field, but has been impacted by your work. Research is an incredibly complicated and dynamic enterprise. So it's hugely important what you do and hugely influential, not only for the university, it defines what the university is, but also beyond that for the impact that it has on the wider society. And that's why we value it so much, and that's why we value you so much. So just to finish, welcome again.